Imagine standing in a room, right? And it is just filled with the most powerful men in the country. You've got governors, founding fathers, the wealthiest merchants of the era.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they are all just staring you down. And you are there because you have to legally prove that your own mind actually belongs to you. Like, you have to prove that the thoughts in your head are yours.
It is an incredibly stark image.
It really is. And in 1772, an enslaved teenager named Phillis Wheatley had to do exactly that.
Right, and it just perfectly encapsulates the impossible paradox of her whole life.
Exactly. And what's wild is that a few years ago, on January 29, 2026, the United States Postal Service released the 49th stamp in their Black Heritage series.
Oh, right, the new stamp.
Yeah. And if you get a piece of mail with that stamp, you might just, gloss right over it before tearing it open. But the face looking back from that tiny square of paper is Phillis Wheatley.
I mean, it's a small piece of real estate on an envelope.
Yeah.
But it represents this massive, almost incomprehensible legacy.
It really does.
Yeah.
So that is exactly what we are getting into today. We are taking a deep dive into her life, her works, and her legacy.
It's such an important story to tell.
It is. Our mission here is to figure out how a young girl who was violently stolen from her home in West Africa managed to master the English language in just a matter of months.
Right.
And not only that, but conquer the 18th century literary world and somehow use the very tools of her enslavers to subtly rebel against them.
Yeah, it's a story of sheer intellectual horsepower, absolutely. Yeah. But at its core, this is a masterclass in survival,
Really?
Because the staggering odds stacked against her before she even picked up a pen well, they're just hard to overstate.
Okay, let's unpack this, because her origin story really sets the stage for everything that follows, right?
Yes, it does.
She was born around 1753, somewhere in West Africa, likely in present-day Gambia or Senegal. And when she was just 7 or 8 years old, she was sold by a local chief.
Right, so you have a child who is ripped entirely from her family, her culture, her language, everything.
Yeah, just gone.
And she is then forced to survive the Middle Passage, which was the brutal, forced transatlantic voyage of enslaved Africans to the Americas.
The conditions on those ships were just horrific.
Beyond horrific. They were designed to strip away every ounce of humanity. I mean, just surviving that journey as a child required immense physical and psychological fortitude.
Unbelievable. So she arrived in Boston on July 11th, 1761, on a ship captained by a man named Peter Gwynn. And the name of that slave ship was the Phillis.
Yeah.
And that is the name her purchasers, this wealthy Boston merchant named John Wheatley and his wife Susanna, gave her. They literally named her after the very vessel that stole her freedom.
It is a deeply chilling detail.
Mm-hmm.
And as was the custom at the time, she was also given the Wheatley family surname.
Right.
So she was forever branded with the identity of her enslavers. Now, she was originally purchased to be a domestic servant for Susanna Wheatley, but very quickly, the family noticed something, well, highly unusual about this young girl.
Yeah, the Wheatley's teenagers, Mary and Nathaniel, they actually began tutoring her.
They did.
But let's really think about the mechanics of this for a second. Because how does a traumatized child who speaks absolutely no English learn to read and write at a genius level in the 1760s?
It's a great question.
I mean, she wasn't just handed a dictionary. Did they use phonetics? Were they sitting by the fire matching up Latin Bible verses with English ones?
Well, the precise day-to-day methodology isn't perfectly documented, but the cognitive leap she made is astonishing.
It's insane.
Usually learning a language under those circumstances is purely functional, learning commands to survive. But Mary and Nathaniel introduced her to theology, mythology, literature. She likely possessed an eidetic memory and an extraordinary ability to recognize linguistic patterns.
Which is crazy because by the age of 12, so that's just 4 or 5 years after arriving, she isn't just reading conversational English.
No, not at all.
She is reading Greek and Latin classics in their original languages. She's translating these incredibly complex passages from the Bible.
Right. And John Wheatley was known as a relatively progressive figure in New England at the time. Seeing her astonishing intellect, the family did something entirely unprecedented.
What was that?
They essentially excused her from household labor. They left the domestic work to their other enslaved workers and focused entirely on Phyllis's education.
Wow. I was trying to find a way to conceptualize this, and it's like, well, imagine someone being locked inside a high-security prison, right?
Okay.
And the guards casually hand them a highly technical manual on advanced cryptography in a language they don't even speak.
Right, right.
And in 5 years, not only can they read the manual, they are writing their own codes that the guards don't even realize are about breaking out.
That's a perfect analogy.
But they are still trapped inside the prison.
Yeah.
That's the tension here. She's diving into Homer and Virgil, writing her first poem by the age of 14, but she is still legally considered household property.
And that tension is the defining reality of her existence.
Mm.
Her brilliant mind was limitless, but her physical body was owned.
Yeah.
The Wheatleys supported her, yes, but they also regularly exhibited her abilities to their friends and family. She was a marvel in the parlor rooms of the Boston elite.
But, you know, parlor room fascination is very different from actual public validation.
Exactly. As her talent grew and they sought to publish her compiled poetry in 1772, that marvel hit a brick wall of racism.
Yeah, the colonists simply didn't believe it.
Right. They refused to believe that an enslaved African teenager could write such complex, excellent poetry. The racism of the era literally blinded them to her genius.
Which brings us back to that room we talked about at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Yes.
She has to go to court. She essentially has to defend her own intellect.
What's fascinating here is the sheer absurdity of the mechanism society required to validate her reality. We're talking about a formal examination by 18 of the most powerful white men in Massachusetts.
18 of them.
Yeah, this included people like John Hancock and the colonial governor Thomas Hutchinson. Picture the scene, you know. These wealthy, powerful men in their wigs and tailored coats sitting in a grand mahogany-paneled room interrogating an enslaved black teenager to determine if she was a fraud.
God, the intimidation factor must have been just suffocating.
Absolutely.
But she passes. She answers their questions. She proves her knowledge of the classics, and she completely outsmarts them. So these 18 elite men signed an attestation.
Which was basically a written permission slip.
Exactly. A permission slip that had to be printed in the preface of her book just so white society would believe she wrote it.
It was a guarantee to white readers that her black intellect was real. And yet, even with the signatures of the founding fathers and the governor, Boston publishers still looked at the manuscript and said no.
They still declined it.
Yeah, they refused to publish her.
So Boston says no. But Susanna Wheatley is determined. In 1773, Phillis travels to London with Nathaniel Wheatley. Now, the trip is partly for her health, because she suffered from severe chronic asthma her whole life. But the primary goal is to find a publisher. And the atmosphere in London is just a total 180-degree shift.
Oh, it's a completely different world for her. In London, she becomes an absolute sensation in the upper echelons of society.
Really?
Yeah. She meets with Frederick Bull, the Lord Mayor of London. She secures the patronage of Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon, who is this deeply influential figure and actually subsidizes the publication of the book.
And on September 1st, 1773, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, is officially published in London.
A huge milestone.
Huge. It makes her internationally famous. She's receiving praise from George Washington, from the French philosopher Voltaire, from the naval hero John Paul Jones. Suddenly, she is the most famous African on the face of the earth.
Incredible, isn't it?
It is. But let's hold on a second, though. I really want to look at the Wheatleys' role in all of this.
Okay.
Because you mentioned they excused her from labor and funded her rise to fame. But looking at this dynamic, I can't help but ask, were the Wheatleys actually acting as genuine progressive allies here? Or was Phillis functioning as their ultimate party trick to show off to Boston high society?
That is the crucial, uncomfortable question historians wrestle with. It is a very complex picture.
Right.
On one hand, affording an enslaved person that level of classical education was practically unheard of, and they did bankroll her international fame.
True.
On the other hand, scholars point out that the family intentionally isolated Phillis from other enslaved people in the home. They molded her, allowed her to attend white social events, but kept her in a very specific, submissive position.
So she was nurtured, but showcased.
Exactly. She was nurtured, absolutely, but she was definitely showcased. She was never allowed to be a threat.
Showcased, but still enslaved. She remained enslaved until just after the book was published in late 1773, when the Wheatleys finally emancipated her. But to understand how she navigated being showcased, we really have to look at the poetry itself. Because at first glance, to the casual 18th century reader, It didn't look like rebellion. It looked like very standard, pious poetry.
Yes, over a third of her poems are elegies.
Elegies.
Yeah, which are basically poems of serious reflection, typically written as a lament for the dead. And the rest of her work leans heavily on Christian themes and classical allusions.
Right. She's mentioning the classics a lot.
Constantly.
Yeah.
She is referencing Alexander Pope, Homer, Horace, and Virgil. So to her white, educated audience, she was writing exactly what they wanted, the words of a civilized Christian convert.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because modern scholars have looked closer and they've realized this wasn't just standard poetry. It was a literary Trojan horse.
A perfect way to describe it.
Right. She was wrapping these fierce anti-slavery sentiments in these elite classical formats that white society adored, so they wouldn't even realize they were being critiqued.
Exactly. Scholars like John C. Shields and Emily Greenwood argue exactly this. Her use of classicism wasn't just mimicry, it was deeply subversive.
How so?
Well, let's look at the mechanics of how she uses language. She frequently uses the word light and constantly references the sun using mythological names like Apollo, Aurora, Phoebus, and Sol.
So put yourself in the shoes of her white readers for a second. You read these poems and think, oh, look at her showing off her Greek mythology vocabulary. How charming. But there's a whole different layer underneath, right?
Oh, absolutely. Shields points out that this obsession with the sun is a direct nod to the African hierophantic solar worship she remembered from her childhood in West Africa.
Hierophantic meaning what exactly?
Basically related to sacred mysteries or holy priesthoods. So scholars believe she was referencing the sacred sun worship practices of her specific West African culture. It was a way of honoring a past she was physically forced to leave behind.
Wow. And the really clever part is the double meaning.
Yes. Brilliantly, sun, S-U-N, functions as a perfect homonym for the Christian sun, S-O-N.
That is just genius.
She is completely satisfying the Christian expectations of her white readers, who think she's praising Jesus, while she is simultaneously honoring her own African heritage.
It's incredible. She's operating on multiple frequencies at once. The enslavers hear one thing, but she is writing another.
Exactly.
And you see this again in her poem to Maecenas, where she claims Terence as her muse. Now, Terence wasn't just any Roman playwright. He was the only African playwright in the ancient Roman canon.
Right.
She writes, "The happier Terence all the choir inspired, but say, ye muses, why this partial grace to one alone of Afric's sable race?"
She is directly pointing out the complexity and the isolation of her own position.
Yeah.
She's asking the muses, and by extension the white literary establishment, why is the genius of African people ignored or treated as some rare, isolated exception?
It's so bold.
It is. Furthermore, Emily Greenwood's research highlights that Wheatley's engagement with these texts shows a deep linguistic familiarity with the actual Latin texts, not just the English translations. She fundamentally understood the material better than many of the 18 men who examined her in Boston.
She used their own cultural touchstones to outsmart them. And my absolute favorite example of this is a poem she wrote in 1768 to King George III.
Oh, that's a great one.
Ostensibly, the poem is praising the king for repealing the Stamp Act. It reads like a very polite, diplomatic poem from an obedient colonial subject. But then she slyly slips in this couplet, "And may each climb with equal gladness see. A monarch's smile can set his subjects free."
It is brilliant political maneuvering.
It really is.
She is engaging in a discussion about the political freedom of the colonists from unfair taxation, but she seamlessly weaves in a direct plea for the physical freedom of enslaved people. She is looking right at the King of England and suggesting, you have the power to free all your subjects.
And she does it so politely, wrapped in such perfect iambic pentameter that they couldn't even be mad at her for it.
Right.
It's a masterstroke. But as triumphant as her intellectual life was, the reality of her physical life, especially after she gained her freedom, was incredibly harsh.
It was.
The transition from her London fame to the end of her life is a very difficult reality to process.
It is deeply tragic. As we mentioned, she was legally freed shortly after her book was published in 1773. But in the 18th century, freedom for a black woman often meant immediate, severe poverty and the loss of any societal protection.
Yeah. Susanna Wheatley died in the spring of 1774, just months after Phillis returned from London. John Wheatley died in 1778. Suddenly, Phillis doesn't have her patrons.
No housing, no financial backing.
Exactly. She doesn't have the backing she relied on to publish. She eventually marries a man named John Peters, who was a free black grocer.
But their life together was incredibly difficult. The economy during the Revolutionary War was chaotic. John struggled massively with debt. They lived in terrible conditions and had up to 3 children, all of whom tragically died in infancy. Her husband was eventually sent to debtor's prison in 1784, leaving her completely alone.
Think about how far she fell, purely due to the systemic barriers of the time. Here is Phillis Wheatley, an international literary sensation, a woman who corresponded with George Washington and was hosted by the Lord Mayor of London.
Yeah.
And she is forced to become a scullery maid in a boarding house just to survive. She is doing heavy, grueling manual labor that she had never done in her life, having been excused from it as a child.
She broke her health.
Her chronic asthma worsened, she developed pneumonia, and she died on December 5th, 1784. She was only 31 years old, and her last infant daughter died the very same day.
It is a devastating, quiet end to a monumental life. But, the struggle didn't end with her death.
What do you mean?
The battle over what Phillis Wheatley meant over her legacy began almost immediately, and it has raged for centuries.
And that historical backlash came from all sides. Let's look at Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers. He brutally dismissed her work in his book Notes on the State of Virginia.
He did.
He essentially refused to acknowledge that a black person could produce real art. He wrote, "Religion indeed has produced a Phillis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism."
He couldn't even be bothered to spell her name right in the text.
Unbelievable.
But if we analyze why Jefferson did this, we see it wasn't just a literary critique. It was a necessary political stance for him.
How so?
To admit her genius, to acknowledge her as an intellectual equal, would be to admit the humanity of the very people he was actively enslaving. He had to dismiss her to maintain the ideological justification for slavery.
That makes complete terrible sense. He had to invalidate her to validate his own system. But the critiques weren't just coming from white historical figures trying to maintain the status quo, right?
No, they weren't. In 1778, a fellow black poet named Jupiter Hammond wrote an ode to her, basically warning her not to succumb to pagan influences and urging her to stay on a strict Christian path.
Wow.
And debates over her identity and her loyalties continued well into the 20th century. If we look at the civil rights movement and the black arts movement of the 1960s and 70s, many black literary scholars viewed her work very harshly.
Let's slow down and look at the context of the 1960s.
Yeah.
Why were they so critical of her?
Well, during the 1960s, the focus was on a strong, militant, unapologetic black identity. Scholars like Eleanor Smith looked back at Wheatley's polite neoclassical poetry and noted the absence of fiery political rhetoric.
Right.
They claimed she suffered from Uncle Tom syndrome. The argument was that her sheltered, submissive upbringing in a white household completely alienated her from her own identity. They felt she was a passive barrier to black liberation because she wasn't writing like a revolutionary.
I really have to push back on those 1960s critiques, though. I mean, reading that just feels incredibly ahistorical.
It does.
You're talking about a girl who survived the trauma of the Middle Passage, who was completely isolated in a white household, and who was literally 100% dependent on her enslavers for survival. To expect an 18th century enslaved teenager to write with the outspoken political rhetoric of Malcolm X or a 1960s activist is just absurd.
Right.
Like, how else could she possibly have survived, let alone gotten published by a racist white establishment, if she hadn't played the exact game she played?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you are echoing the exact arguments made by more recent scholars who have fiercely defended her against those mid-century critiques.
Oh, really?
Yes. As the scholar Sandra O'Neill pointed out, critics who judge her rarely suggest what alternative tactics were available to a writer who is legally considered property.
Exactly.
There simply wasn't another option for her. She couldn't write an overt manifesto.
No, she couldn't. You play the hand you dealt. She used the only tools available to her.
Right, which is why modern scholars like Henry Louis Gates, Cherno Cisse Jr., and the poet Honoré Fanone Jeffers, who wrote The Age of Phillis, have worked so hard to rehabilitate her image.
That makes sense.
They argue that we need to stop stereotyping her and actually read the texts closely. When you do, as we discussed with her classical subversions and the sun imagery, you see that she was making profound anti-slavery statements.
They were just hidden.
Yes. She just had to embed them deep within the strict confines of her era. She wasn't ignoring her enslavement. She was actively outsmarting her captors on a level they couldn't even comprehend.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, centuries later?
Ultimately, Phillis Wheatley teaches us about the astonishing resilience of the human mind. She demonstrates the sheer power of taking the tools you are handed, even when those tools were explicitly designed to exclude you or control you, and mastering them to carve out your own permanent space in history.
Beautifully said.
She forced a world that viewed her as property to look her in the eye and acknowledge her as a peer.
It is an incredible legacy, and it brings me right back to that mahogany room in Boston in 1772.
Right.
Think about that attestation printed in the front of her book, that literal piece of paper signed by 18 powerful men just to validate her existence as a thinker. It really makes you wonder who in today's world is still being forced to carry a metaphorical permission slip.
Oh, yeah.
Who is still having to prove to the establishment that their voice actually belongs in the room. And maybe most importantly, how much sheer genius are we missing out on right now simply because society still demands that the right people sign off on it first.